Adobe RGB 1998. We talked about RGB. We talked about its counterpart, which is CMY or CMYK. Okay. But did you guys know that there's different flavors or variations of RGB? Yeah, here's the thing. If I click on this pop-up, take a look at this. Now, most of these you would never use. You'll see there's like everything that's installed on your system is on here. Only these ones up here are editing profiles. We've got Adobe RGB, Color Match, Display P3, Profoto sRGB. What are those all about? Is that just to be confusing? Yes, it is. That's why we put them there. No, actually, Adobe RGB 1998, that's the one that we're using now. That's kind of like what the industry expects. sRGB, have you ever heard that term before? It stands for Standard RGB, and way back when computers first got the ability to show color, they wanted a way to make sure that what somebody saw on this monitor was at least reasonably close to what somebody would see on that monitor. Or if they were to output it, whatever devices they had that were capable of making color at the time, it would look reasonably similar. So they came up with this standard RGB space, and it was kind of not necessarily the lowest common denominator, but what most things were capable of. But as time went by, monitors got better, printers got better, and Adobe eventually said, you know what, we need to come up with a better color space. So they came up with Adobe RGB 1998. Anybody know what year they developed it? 97. They released it in 98. So it's better. Just how much better? Let's take a look. So here's Adobe RGB 1998. This is a gamut graph. Basically, this shows the gamut, or the amount of color that is available within Adobe RGB 1998. Now I'm going to hold this for a second, and let's compare it with sRGB, ignoring the homicide going on in the hall. Oh, sRGB is quite a bit smaller. Look at that. So, you got a picture of some limes and their colors. Adobe RGB can contain this much, but S, not as much. Some red flowers, not the same kind of saturation. So clearly sRGB is not as good as Adobe RGB 1998. Does that mean that it's dead in the water? We should just never use it for anything, ever? Not necessarily, unfortunately. Again, a lot of you admitted to having phones that can take photographs, which is like miraculous. Did you know that they're all shooting in sRGB? And you're like, well, wait a minute, but look how much better Adobe RGB is. Well, I guess my phone just can't see it. Well, it can, but they intentionally have it shoot in the crappier sRGB. Most point-and-shoot cameras shoot in sRGB. Anybody know why they might do that? It's to avoid disappointment. So to prevent you being disappointed by your results, they intentionally dumb it down. Has anybody ever sent a file off to like Photolab to have some actual prints made, some actual photographs, paper? They probably wanted them in sRGB, didn't they? And the reason for that, back in the days of film, you'd take your negatives in and they would put them into an enlarger, which would project the negative onto a piece of photographic paper, which would then go through the RA4 chemical process and get developed, dried, and would come out the other end as a photograph. You'd be like, yay! And then when the digital revolution came around, they had all this investment in that machinery down below. So rather than getting rid of that, they took the enlargers off and they put on these digital exposure units that use lasers or LEDs to expose the exact same RA4 paper through the exact same RA4 chemicals, and it has pretty much the same gamut as it had back in the days of film. So to avoid disappointment, they have your cameras shoot in sRGB, which is a gamut that is much closer to what those machines are capable of. So when you get your prints, you'll be like, yep, that's pretty much what I saw on my phone. Or another thing, how many people have heard of the internet? A few of you? Okay, if you haven't, Google it, because I think it's going to be big. But the internet, we got access to it before 1998. So the official color space of the web is still sRGB. If you post something to Facebook or Instagram, it'll actually get converted to sRGB, even if you post it in Adobe RGB. Now, most modern web browsers, I think all modern web browsers, are ICC or color sync aware, which means that they would show an Adobe RGB file properly. But if somebody looked at it in an older, so like an old version of Internet Explorer or something that isn't color sync aware, it would look all kind of faded and washed out. So sRGB, still the official color space of the web. So that's why we've got that sRGB option in there, even though it sucks to a very large degree. Color match, don't worry about it. Display P3, don't worry about it. Profoto RGB, don't worry about it, but it is worth mentioning. Profoto RGB, how many people use Lightroom? A few of you. Okay. Internally, Lightroom uses Profoto RGB. If you export something to Photoshop for work and bring it back into Lightroom, it'll work on it in Profoto. But look at this. It is huge. It is a massive color space. If we compare this even to Adobe RGB, you can see it is quite a bit larger. Profoto RGB contains more colors than any monitor can show you. It contains more colors than any printer can print. It contains more colors than the human visual system can perceive. There are colors in Adobe RGB that are, imaginary. We can't see them. So you might think, well, if it's that big, why don't we use it for everything? Well, the problem is because it's so large, there is no monitor that can show you everything that's in there. There is no printer that can print it all. You can't see them all. And working with colors that are outside what you can see either by your monitor or even, if you did some magic monitor that could show everything that Profoto is capable of, you wouldn't be able to perceive them. There can be unexpected things happening. So the industry is still working in Adobe RGB 1998, 20 years after it came out. I had a job once, it was a magazine, and the photographer just forwarded me the image that he'd processed from his raw file. I did all the retouching, I sent it on to the magazine, and then they emailed me a couple days later saying that the proofs were coming out all weird. So I looked at the file, and sure enough, the photographer had processed it into Profoto RGB. So I converted it to Adobe, sent it back to the magazine, they did the proofs again, and everything was fine. So the industry is expecting to get Adobe RGB 1998. So whenever you're working on something, work in Adobe RGB 1998. Now let's say you're doing something for a magazine. They're going to be printing it in CMYK, aren't they? Cyan, magenta, yellow, and black ink. Now RGB only has 3 colors. CMYK, that has 4. So what do you think is a larger color space? CMYK or Adobe RGB? Look at that. There's CMYK tucked up inside. It is a nasty little color space. So if you're doing a job for a magazine and you know it's going to be printed in a magazine, rather than working on it in CMYK, work on it in Adobe RGB. When you're done, save it up, and then make a copy of it that you convert down to CMYK. Or ideally, just send it on to the magazine and hopefully they'll take the Adobe RGB and they'll do the conversion themselves. The reason for that is, let's say they run it in the magazine and they say, oh, it worked out great. Now we want to put it on our website. Well, sRGB was larger than that. Or maybe we want to send out some promotional things. We're going to print them on, we have like a nice Epson printer. The Epson printers down the hall that we have here, much higher gamut than CMYK. So even though printers have cyan, magenta, yellow, and black inks in them, they're still RGB devices. So always work in your best quality, which is going to be Adobe RGB and 16 bits per color channel.